"You're fired for poor results," my father-in-law said at the company board meeting. My husband's father, the CEO, looked me in the eye and whispered those words with such venom that I felt the entire conference room hold its breath. That night, my husband slid a list of shelters across the table and said, "You're on your own now." I walked out quietly. Days later, he and his father blew up my phone. 78 missed calls after discovering who I truly was. My name is Elena Morrison, and I'm 34 years old. 3 weeks ago, I was sitting in that polished boardroom at Ashford Industries, surrounded by executives in $1,000 suits, when Richard Ashford, my father-in-law and the company's CEO, pointed at the quarterly reports and declared my division a failure. "These numbers are embarrassing," he announced to the room of 12 people. "Elena, you're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out." The betrayal wasn't just professional. My husband, David Ashford, sat 3 seats away and didn't say a single word. He wouldn't even look at me. I gathered my notebook and stood. No tears, no pleading. The security guard who appeared at the door looked uncomfortable as he waited to escort me out like a criminal. I walked past my husband without a glance, past Richard's satisfied smirk, past the other executives who suddenly found their phones fascinating. The click of my heels on the marble floor was the only sound. When I reached my former office, 2 more security guards were already there, watching as I collected my personal items. A framed photo of my wedding day, a coffee mug my sister gave me. Nothing else belonged to me in that cold, corporate space. That evening, David came home late. I was sitting at our kitchen island still processing what had happened when he walked in without his usual kiss on my cheek. He didn't ask if I was okay. Instead, he pulled out his phone, scrolled for a moment, then showed me a list. "What's this?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the chaos inside me. "Homeless shelters," he replied flatly. "You'll need options. The penthouse is in my name. You have until Sunday to find somewhere else." 3 days. He was giving me 3 days to leave the home we'd shared for 5 years. I stared at him, searching for any trace of the man I'd married. "David, we're married. You can't just—" He cut me off with a bitter laugh. "We're separated as of today. My lawyer will send you papers tomorrow." "Dad's right. You've been dead weight for too long. I need someone who can actually contribute." The words hit like physical blows. Dead weight. All those years of supporting his career, attending endless corporate dinners, playing the perfect wife while building my division from nothing. None of it mattered. I was disposable. "Your father set me up," I said quietly. "Those numbers were manipulated. If you look at the actual—" David held up his hand. "Save it, Elena. The numbers don't lie. You failed. End of story." He walked to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen with a list of shelters on the marble countertop. I looked down at my phone. 7 texts from my sister asking if I was okay, 2 from my mother, 1 from my best friend Natalie who'd heard rumors. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I opened my banking app and transferred funds from our joint account to my personal one. Exactly 50%, down to the last cent. If David wanted separation, he'd get it. I spent the next 2 hours packing essentials. Clothes, documents, jewelry that belonged to me before the marriage. David stayed in the bedroom with the door closed, probably on the phone with his father, celebrating their victory. By midnight, I'd loaded everything into my car and driven to a hotel near the financial district. Not a shelter, never a shelter. I checked in under my maiden name and sat on the hotel bed, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of the betrayal. My husband had thrown me away like trash. His father had publicly humiliated me, and somewhere in their arrogance, they'd both forgotten something crucial. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls from David, then 12 more from Richard. By noon, the number had climbed to 38. I ignored every single one. Instead, I called my lawyer, not the family attorney David and I had used for estate planning, but Marcus Chen, a ruthless divorce specialist who'd helped a friend navigate a messy separation last year. "Elena," Marcus greeted me warmly. "I heard what happened at Ashford. I've been expecting your call." We met that afternoon at his office downtown. I showed him the shelter list David had given me, detailed the public firing, explained the manipulated quarterly reports. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "They made a mistake," he said finally. "A big one. Richard Ashford thinks he's untouchable, but corporate law doesn't care about family ties. If those numbers were falsified to justify your termination, we have grounds for wrongful dismissal and possibly fraud." He leaned forward. "But Elena, I need to ask, do you want to fight this, or do you want to destroy them?" I thought about David's face when he'd handed me that shelter list, the coldness in Richard's eyes during the board meeting, the humiliation of being escorted out by security while my colleagues watched. "I want them to understand exactly who they threw away," I answered. Marcus smiled. "Then we'll need to move quickly. I'll file for divorce and wrongful termination by end of day. But there's something else, something I think you should consider." He slid a folder across his desk. "Ashford Industries is more vulnerable than they realize. Richard's been aggressive with acquisitions lately, leveraging the company heavily. If the right information came to light, their stock could take a serious hit." I opened the folder and scanned the financial analysis. Marcus was right. The company was overextended, barely maintaining investor confidence. One scandal, one hint of financial impropriety, and everything Richard had built could crumble. "How long do we have?" I asked. "Before they figure out what's happening?" Marcus checked his watch. "The divorce papers will hit David tomorrow morning. The wrongful termination suit gets filed with the labor board same day. After that, it's a race. They'll lawyer up fast, try to bury everything under NDAs and settlements." He paused. "Unless you have leverage they don't know about." I thought about the flash drive hidden in my purse. 5 years of working at Ashford had taught me to keep detailed records, not out of paranoia, but professional habit. Every email, every financial report, every conversation I'd documented for my own performance reviews, including several that showed Richard's pattern of manipulating numbers to push out executive executives he didn't like. I might have something, I said carefully. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Might have, or definitely have. I met his gaze. I have proof that my quarterly numbers were deliberately altered. I also have evidence of similar manipulation in 3 other divisions over the past 2 years. Richard has a system. He targets executives, sabotages their performance metrics, then fires them publicly to maintain his reputation as a tough leader. The room went quiet. Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Elena, if what you're saying is true, we're not just talking about wrongful termination. We're talking about systematic fraud, potential securities violations, maybe even RICO if he's been doing this to avoid severance packages. I pulled out the flash drive and set it on his desk. Everything's there. Emails between Richard and the CFO, spreadsheets showing the original numbers versus the altered reports, meeting notes where they discussed which executives to target next. Marcus picked up the flash drive like it was made of gold. How did you get all this? He asked. I was meticulous about documentation, I explained. Every report that crossed my desk, I kept a copy. Every email, I archived. When the numbers started not adding up 3 months ago, I began comparing my records to what was being presented at board meetings. The discrepancies were obvious once I looked for them. Marcus stood and walked to his window overlooking the city. Elena, do you understand what this means? If we go public with this information, we won't just be fighting a wrongful termination case. We'll be bringing down one of the largest privately held companies in the state. Richard Ashford will lose everything. His reputation, his company, possibly his freedom. He turned to face me. And your husband will lose his inheritance, his career, his entire family legacy. Are you prepared for that level of karma? Because once we pull this trigger, there's no going back. I thought about David's face when he'd handed me that shelter list, the satisfaction in Richard's voice when he'd called my work embarrassing, the 5 years I'd spent trying to earn their respect, only to be discarded the moment I became inconvenient. They threw me away like I was nothing, I said quietly. They never once considered that I might have value beyond what I could do for them. So yes, Marcus, I'm prepared. Let them see exactly what truth revealed looks like when you betray the wrong person. Marcus worked through the night analyzing the flash drive. By morning, he'd assembled a legal strategy that would hit the Ashfords from multiple angles simultaneously. We file the divorce papers first thing, he explained over coffee in his office at 6 a.m. That's expected. David will think you're just being emotional. Then an hour later, the wrongful termination suit gets filed. That'll rattle them, but they'll assume it's standard angry employee behavior. They'll offer you a settlement to go away quietly. And then, I asked, sipping the bitter coffee that tasted like revenge and justice mixed together. Then we wait exactly 48 hours, Marcus continued. During that time, Richard will feel confident. He'll think he's won. He'll probably even celebrate with David, talk about how they dodged a bullet. That's when we drop the real bomb. A federal complaint to the SEC detailing the systematic fraud, complete with all your documentation. By the time they realize what's happening, the damage will be irreversible. I nodded slowly, processing the timeline. 2 days. In 48 hours, the Ashfords' world would begin collapsing. What about the calls? I asked. They've been blowing up my phone since yesterday afternoon. 78 calls between David and Richard by last count. Marcus smiled grimly. Don't answer. Let them panic. The more desperate they get, the more mistakes they'll make. Desperate people reveal things they normally keep hidden. Your silence is its own kind of power right now, Elena. The divorce papers were delivered to David at 9 a.m. I know because Natalie, my best friend who still worked at Ashford Industries, texted me immediately. David just got served in his office. Threw the papers across the room and started screaming your name. Security had to calm him down. Everyone on the floor heard it. The image made me smile. Perfect. Let him feel a fraction of the humiliation he'd caused me. By 10 a.m., my phone showed 93 missed calls. Richard had joined the chorus, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails. Elena, we need to talk about this rationally. You're making a mistake. Call me back immediately. His voice carried that same commanding tone he'd used to fire me, but underneath I detected something new. Fear. They were starting to realize I wasn't going to quietly disappear into one of those shelters. The wrongful termination suit hit the labor board at 11 a.m. Marcus filed it personally, including just enough detail to suggest we had evidence without revealing our full hand. The complaint outlined my excellent performance history, the suspicious timing of my termination, and the manipulated quarterly reports. Within hours, it was public record. By noon, 3 business reporters had picked up the story. Former executive sues Ashford Industries for wrongful termination. Read the headline on the city's major business news site. Natalie called me at lunch, her voice urgent. Elena, it's chaos here. Richard called an emergency meeting with all division heads. He's telling everyone you're a disgruntled employee making false accusations. But people are talking. Some of the other executives are quietly pulling their own records, checking their numbers. I think you're not the only one who noticed the irregularities. This was exactly what we'd hoped for. Once you pull one thread, the whole fabric starts to unravel. David finally caught me that afternoon. I'd stopped at my sister's house to drop off some belongings, and he was waiting outside when I arrived. He looked terrible. Wrinkled suit, dark circles under his eyes, hair uncombed. Elena, please, we need to talk. He stepped toward me, and I held up my hand. Talk to my lawyer, I said coldly. That's what you told me to do, remember? When I tried to explain about the manipulated numbers? I was angry, David said, his voice cracking. Dad was in my ear, and I wasn't thinking straight. But this, divorce papers, public lawsuits, you're destroying my family's legacy over a misunderstanding. I stared at him, genuinely amazed by his audacity. A misunderstanding? You handed me a list of homeless shelters, David. You told me I was dead weight. You sat in that boardroom and said nothing while your father humiliated me in front of 12 people. Which part of that that was a misunderstanding. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing. Now it just looked pathetic. Dad said it had to be done that way, for the company's image. We were going to take care of you privately, set you up with a consulting position somewhere, but then you had to go nuclear with these lawsuits. The truth crystallized in his words. They'd planned this. The public firing, the immediate disposal, all of it orchestrated to maintain Richard's reputation as a decisive leader. I was never meant to fight back. I was supposed to slink away quietly, grateful for whatever crumbs they threw me. Get off my sister's property, I said quietly, before I call the police and add harassment to the list of complaints. David's face hardened. You're making a huge mistake, Elena. Dad has connections everywhere. Judges, politicians, media executives. He'll bury you in legal fees until you have nothing left. Is your pride really worth destroying your entire future? I smiled, and something in my expression made him step back. David, you and your father have no idea what you've done, but you will. Very soon. That night, Marcus called with an update. The labor board accepted our complaint and opened an investigation. More importantly, 3 other former Ashford executives contacted me today. They all have similar stories. Manipulated numbers, sudden terminations, NDAs they were pressured to sign. One of them kept documentation like you did. This isn't just your case anymore, Elena. It's a pattern of corporate fraud spanning at least 5 years. The pieces were falling into place faster than I'd anticipated. What does that mean for our timeline? I asked. Marcus paused. It means we might not need to wait 48 hours. With multiple victims coming forward, the SEC will take this more seriously. I'm thinking we file the federal complaint tomorrow morning instead. Strike while they're already reeling from the wrongful termination suit. I agreed, and we spent the next hour refining our strategy. The federal complaint would include testimony from all 4 executives, spreadsheets showing the pattern of manipulation, and, most damaging, emails proving Richard knew exactly what he was doing. By the time we finished, it was nearly midnight. I fell asleep in the hotel bed, exhausted but strangely peaceful. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The call came at 6:30 a.m. Richard Ashford himself, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Elena, I'm prepared to offer you a very generous settlement. $300,000, a non-disclosure agreement, and a neutral reference for future employment. All you have to do is drop the wrongful termination suit and sign the papers. $300,000. It was a substantial amount, more than a year's salary. To Richard, it probably seemed like a fortune he was generously bestowing. To me, it was confirmation that they were scared. I'll think about it, I lied. My lawyer will be in touch. I hung up before Richard could respond. Marcus had told me they'd try to buy me off. The fact that they'd moved this quickly with such a large offer meant they knew the situation was worse than they'd initially realized. Somewhere in the Ashford Industries offices, lawyers were probably pulling records right now, discovering just how extensive the fraud was. By 8 a.m., the settlement offer had doubled, $600,000. Richard's personal assistant called, her voice syrupy sweet. Mr. Ashford wants you to know this is his final offer. He's being extraordinarily generous, given the circumstances. All you need to do is come to the office this morning and sign. The urgency in her voice told me everything. They needed this shut down immediately before more people started asking questions. Tell Mr. Ashford I'll consider his generosity, I replied. I need to discuss it with my legal counsel first. The assistant's facade cracked slightly. Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Ashford needs an answer today, preferably within the next few hours. This offer won't remain on the table indefinitely. I smiled at her use of Mrs. Ashford, a subtle reminder that I was still technically family. I understand the urgency, I said smoothly. I'll have my lawyer contact you this afternoon. I hung up and immediately called Marcus. They just offered $600,000. Richard's panicking. Marcus laughed, a sound of pure satisfaction. Of course he is. I just got confirmation that the SEC accepted our federal complaint. They're opening a formal investigation into Ashford Industries. Richard probably got the notification about an hour ago. That settlement offer? That's desperation, Elena. He's trying to buy your silence before the federal investigators start asking questions. Should we respond? I asked. Counter with a higher number? Drag it out? Marcus considered this. No, radio silence is more powerful right now. Let him sweat. The SEC investigation is public record as of this morning. By noon, every business reporter in the city will be writing about it. Richard's trying to plug a hole in a dam that's already breaking. Nothing he offers you now can stop what's coming. The news broke at exactly 11:45 a.m. Federal investigation launched into Ashford Industries' financial practices, screamed the headline. The article detailed the complaint filed by multiple former executives, alleging systematic manipulation of performance data. It mentioned my wrongful termination suit specifically, along with the pattern of similar cases over 5 years. The reporter had even found 2 additional former employees willing to go on record about suspicious circumstances around their departures. My phone exploded. David called 6 times in 10 minutes. Richard's assistant called twice, then Richard himself, then David again. I silenced the phone and watched the missed call counter climb. 15, 20, 30. Natalie sent a text. Complete meltdown at the office. Stock dropping. Major investors calling emergency meetings. Richard locked in his office. David throwing things in his. You did it, Elena. You actually did it. By 2 p.m., Ashford Industries stock had dropped 18%. The privately held shares that formed the basis of the Ashford family wealth had lost millions of dollars in value in a matter of hours. More former employees were coming forward, each with their own story of manipulation and betrayal. The federal investigation was expanding beyond Richard's termination tactics to examine the company's broader financial practices. Everything Marcus had predicted was happening, but faster and more dramatically than we'd imagined. David showed up at my hotel at 4 p.m. Security called up to ask if I wanted them to send him away, but I was curious enough to agree to meet him in the lobby. He looked even worse than yesterday. Suit completely wrinkled now, eyes wild, hands shaking. Elena, please, you have to stop this. The company is collapsing. We've lost $12 million in share value today alone. Major clients are threatening to pull their contracts. This isn't just hurting Dad. It's hurting hundreds of employees who did nothing wrong. I sat in the lobby chair across from him, my expression neutral. You mean like I did nothing wrong before your father destroyed my career and you handed me a list of homeless shelters? David flinched. I know what we did was terrible. I know I failed you as a husband, but this is revenge on a scale that's going to destroy innocent people. Please just tell me what you want. Whatever it takes to make this stop. I want the truth to come out, I said simply. I want everyone to know what your father really is, what you really are. I want the world to see that the Ashford family's success was built on lies and manipulation and throwing people away when they became inconvenient. I leaned forward. You asked me what I want, David? I want karma. I want justice. And I want you to understand that when you betray someone, you better make absolutely certain they don't have the power to fight back. David's face went pale. You planned this from the beginning. You kept records. You knew exactly what you were doing. I stood up. I kept records because I'm thorough and professional. Qualities your father called embarrassing in that board meeting. The rest? That was all you and Richard. You created this situation when you decided I was disposable. Now you get to live with the consequences. I walked toward the elevator, leaving David sitting in the lobby chair looking completely broken. Behind me, I heard him make another phone call. Dad, she's not going to stop. We need to. The elevator doors closed, cutting off his voice. Upstairs in my hotel room, Marcus was waiting with more news. 3 more executives came forward this afternoon. One of them was the CFO who resigned mysteriously 2 years ago. He's willing to testify that Richard ordered him to manipulate financial data, and when he refused, Richard forced him out and made him sign an NDA. This is huge, Elena. We're not just talking about wrongful termination anymore. We're talking about potential criminal charges. How long before they try something desperate? I asked. Marcus looked grim. They're already desperate. That settlement offer, David showing up here, the phone calls, that's desperation. But truly desperate? When they realize money can't fix this, that's when things get dangerous. Richard Ashford has spent 30 years building his empire. He's not going to let it fall without a fight. As if on cue, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered on speaker so Marcus could hear. Elena Ashford? The voice was smooth, professional, unfamiliar. This is Gerald Hutchins. I'm the attorney representing Richard Ashford and Ashford Industries. I'm calling to inform you that if you continue with these baseless allegations, we'll have no choice but to file a defamation suit. Additionally, we have evidence that you may have stolen proprietary company information, which could result in criminal charges for corporate espionage. Marcus grabbed the phone. This is Marcus Chen, Mrs. Morrison's attorney. You can direct all future communications to me. And counselor, threatening my client with criminal charges for reporting fraud to federal authorities is itself a crime. I'd suggest you advise your client to focus on preparing his defense rather than making threats he can't follow through on. Marcus hung up before the lawyer could respond. They're cornered, Marcus said, pacing the hotel room. That call wasn't about legal strategy. It was intimidation, plain and simple. They're hoping you'll get scared and back down, which means they don't have any real leverage. If they did, they wouldn't need to threaten you. He stopped pacing and looked at me seriously. Elena, the next 48 hours are critical. The SEC investigation is just beginning. The wrongful termination case will take months, but public opinion, that's being shaped right now. We need to control the narrative. What do you suggest? I asked. Marcus pulled out his laptop. I've arranged an interview with Sarah Chen from Business Week. She's the best investigative reporter in the industry, and she's been following the Ashford Industries story since your termination went public. She wants to hear your side, on record, with your name attached. It'll be published tomorrow morning, time to coincide with the SEC's first round of subpoenas. I thought about this carefully. Once I went public with my story, there was no anonymity, no privacy. The Ashfords would come after me with everything they had, but they were already doing that. At least this way, I'd be telling my own truth instead of letting them control the narrative. Set up the interview, I decided. Tomorrow morning. I want to look Richard and David in the eye through that article and let them know I'm not hiding anymore. Marcus made the call while I sat on the hotel bed, watching the sunset through the window. Somewhere across the city, in their luxury penthouse, the Ashfords were probably having a very different kind of evening. No celebrating, no victory toasts, just panic and recrimination, and the slow dawning realization that the woman they'd thrown away had the power to destroy everything they built, and I was just getting started. The interview with Sarah Chen took place at 7 a.m. in a private conference room Marcus had rented specifically for this purpose. Sarah arrived with a recording device, a photographer, and an intensity that reminded me why she'd won 2 journalism awards for corporate exposés. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, dressed in a no-nonsense navy suit. Elena, she said, shaking my hand firmly, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I've been following the Ashford Industries story, and I have to say, the pieces are starting to form a very disturbing picture. We sat across from each other, the recording device between us like a small witness to everything I was about to reveal. Before we start, Sarah said, I need you to understand that once this article publishes, you become the public face of this scandal. The Ashfords will attack your credibility, your character, everything. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? I thought about David handing me that shelter list, about Richard's satisfied smirk in the boardroom, about the 78 missed calls that proved their panic. I'm prepared, I answered, "The truth is worth whatever comes next." Sarah pressed record. "Tell me about your first day at Ashford Industries." For the next 3 hours, I walked her through everything. How I'd started as a junior analyst 7 years ago, met David at a company charity event, how our relationship had seemed genuine before I understood the family dynamics. Richard controlled everything, I explained. Who got promoted, who got fired, who was worthy of the Ashford name. When David and I got engaged, Richard made it clear that my value was tied directly to my professional performance. I wasn't just marrying David, I was marrying into a corporate dynasty where love came with quarterly performance reviews. Sarah's pen flew across her notepad even though everything was being recorded. "When did you first notice the irregularities in the financial reports?" she asked. I pulled out my laptop and showed her the spreadsheets side by side. My original reports versus what had been presented at board meetings 3 months ago. Small changes at first. A percentage point here, a decimal place there. Then it escalated. By the time of my termination, the reports being shown to the board bore almost no resemblance to the actual data. My division wasn't failing. It was outperforming projections. But Richard needed a scapegoat. Why? Sarah leaned forward. "What did Richard gain by destroying your career?" This was the question I'd been waiting for. Control. Richard has a pattern. Every 2 or 3 years, he publicly fires an executive. Always someone who's gained too much independent respect within the company. It sends a message to everyone else. Your success isn't really yours. It belongs to Richard Ashford, and he can take it away whenever he wants. It keeps people scared, compliant, desperate to please him. Sarah checked her notes. I've spoken with 4 other former executives who describe similar experiences. Each was fired publicly after mysteriously poor performance reviews. Each was pressured to sign NDAs. Each walked away believing they'd actually failed, until now. She looked up at me. "You're the first one who kept documentation." "Why?" I smiled slightly. "My mother always told me to keep records of everything in business. She said you never know when someone might try to rewrite history. I didn't keep the files because I suspected Richard. I kept them because I'm thorough." Turns out Mom was right about people rewriting history. The photographer took several shots during a break. Me reviewing documents, looking pensively out the window, sitting at the conference table with my hands folded. Professional victim, I thought wryly. That's what Richard would call these photos. But I looked calm, composed, credible, the opposite of how they wanted me to appear. Sarah returned from checking her messages with a strange expression. "Elena, something just happened that you need to know about. 20 minutes ago, Richard Ashford held an impromptu press conference outside Ashford Industries headquarters." Marcus pulled up a video on his phone. There was Richard, looking smaller somehow without the boardroom and the power suit to inflate his presence. "These allegations are completely false," he was saying to a cluster of reporters. "Ms. Morrison was terminated due to legitimate performance issues. Her subsequent actions, the lawsuits, the federal complaints, are the desperate attempts of a vindictive ex-employee who's angry about a failed marriage. My son is devastated by her betrayal, and our family asks for privacy during this difficult time." I watched the video twice, noting every detail. The way Richard's left eye twitched when he lied, the defensive posture, arms crossed, the carefully chosen words, failed marriage, not divorce, Ms. Morrison, not my daughter-in-law, vindictive, not angry. He was trying to paint me as an emotional woman scorned, using the oldest weapon in the book to discredit my accusations. "That's not going to work," Sarah said confidently. "I've seen the documentation you provided. This isn't about hurt feelings. It's about systematic fraud. My article will make that clear." But Richard's press conference had an immediate effect. Within an hour, 3 conservative news sites had picked up his narrative. "Bitter ex-wife attacks successful company," read one headline. "Woman scorned weaponizes Me Too movement against innocent CEO," declared another. The comment sections were vicious. Dozens of people who knew nothing about the case except Richard's 5-minute press conference were already declaring me a gold digger, a liar, a woman using false accusations to punish her ex-husband. Marcus saw my expression as I scrolled through the comments. "Don't read those," he advised gently. "Anonymous internet commenters don't matter. What matters is that we have documentation, multiple witnesses, and a federal investigation. Richard's trying to win in the court of public opinion because he knows he'll lose in an actual court." But the comments still stung, not because I believed them, but because they revealed how easily people accepted a powerful man's word over a woman's documented evidence. My sister called mid-morning, her voice tight with concern. "Elena, I just saw the news. Are you okay? Some of my neighbors are already gossiping about you, saying terrible things." I took a breath. "I'm fine, Jen. This is exactly what we expected. Richard's scared, so he's attacking, but the truth is going to come out." Jen was quiet for a moment. "I believe you. Mom believes you. We're all behind you. But I'm worried about what this is doing to you emotionally. First the betrayal, then the divorce, now being dragged through the mud publicly. How are you really holding up?" The question hit deeper than she probably intended. How was I holding up? I'd been running on adrenaline and righteous anger for days, but underneath that, I was exhausted, hurt, betrayed not just by David and Richard, but by a system that immediately assumed a powerful man must be telling the truth and a wronged woman must be lying. "I'm surviving," I told Jen honestly, "and that's going to have to be enough for now. Once this is over, I'll fall apart, but right now, I have to stay strong." That afternoon, Marcus received a package via courier. Inside was a thumb drive and a handwritten note. "You need to see this. A friend at Ashford Industries." We loaded the drive onto Marcus's laptop, and what we found made both of us go silent. It was video footage from the Ashford Industries security cameras, specifically footage from Richard's office on 3 separate occasions over the past 2 years. In each video, Richard was clearly visible meeting with the CFO, reviewing spreadsheets, and explicitly discussing which numbers to alter shelter and how. This is incredible, Marcus whispered, watching the videos for a second time. This is Richard on camera committing fraud. Who sent this? We examined the note again. The handwriting was neat, feminine, unfamiliar. No signature, no return address, just a friend. Someone inside Ashford Industries had access to the security footage and wanted Richard to go down. An ally I didn't even know I had. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard's own security system was now providing evidence of his crimes. Marcus immediately contacted the SEC investigator assigned to the case. I have new evidence you need to see. Video footage of the CEO explicitly ordering financial manipulation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Can you have it here within the hour? The investigator asked. I'm already on my way, Marcus replied. He turned to me after hanging up. Elena, this changes everything. Video evidence is nearly impossible to dispute. With this, the SEC can move much faster. We might see criminal charges within weeks, not months. While Marcus delivered the thumb drive to federal investigators, I stayed in the hotel room trying to process everything. My phone continued its steady stream of notifications. More news articles, more social media comments, more missed calls from David and Richard. But mixed in with the hate and the skepticism were messages of support. Former colleagues reaching out privately to say they believed me. Women who'd faced similar situations sharing their own stories. Even a few current Ashford Industries employees using anonymous accounts, providing additional information about Richard's tactics. One message in particular caught my attention. It was from Amanda Reeves, a senior executive who'd been at Ashford for 15 years. Elena, I can't go public yet. I have kids to feed and a mortgage to pay. But I want you to know that you're doing the right thing. Richard has terrorized this company for years. People are too scared to speak up because they've seen what happens to anyone who challenges him. But watching you fight back is giving others courage. Don't give up. You're not alone in this. I saved the message, reading it 3 times. Maybe I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. Sarah Chen's article published at 6 p.m. timed perfectly for maximum visibility during the evening news cycle. The house that Richard Ashford built, how one CEO's culture of fear led to systematic fraud, read the headline. The article was devastating. Sarah had woven together my interview, statements from the other former executives, analysis of the financial documents, and quotes from anonymous current employees. She fact-checked everything meticulously, presenting not just allegations, but a comprehensive picture of corruption. The key paragraph that would be quoted everywhere read, Elena Morrison isn't a scorned ex-wife seeking revenge. She's the accomplished executive with 7 years of documented excellent performance who kept meticulous records as a matter of professional habit. Those records now form the backbone of a federal investigation that threatens to unravel one of the region's most respected business empires. If the allegations are proven true and the evidence appears substantial, Richard Ashford didn't just fire his daughter-in-law, he fired the woman who would eventually expose him. Within an hour, Sarah's article was everywhere. Major news networks were quoting it. Business analysts were discussing it on financial shows. Social media had shifted from attacking me to questioning Richard's press conference. The anonymous commenters who'd been so quick to call me a liar were now backpedaling, claiming they'd always suspected something was wrong at Ashford Industries. The court of public opinion, fickle as always, was starting to turn. David called at 7:30. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Elena? His voice was flat, defeated. I just read the Business Week article. I didn't know. About the others. About Dad's system. I swear to you, I thought you really had failed. I thought, he broke off. It doesn't matter what I thought. I was wrong. Completely, devastatingly wrong. And I'm so sorry. The apology hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to accept it, to believe that David had been genuinely fooled by his father. But a larger part remembered the shelter list, the coldness in his eyes, the ease with which he'd thrown me away. You were wrong, I agreed quietly. But not just about the numbers, David. You were wrong about me, about what I was worth, about whether I deserved basic human decency, even if I had failed. You didn't just believe your father's lies about my performance, you wanted to believe them, because it gave you permission to discard me without guilt. I paused, letting the words sink in. Your apology doesn't change what you did. It just confirms that your respect for me was always conditional on success. And that's not love, David. That's not even friendship. That's just transaction. He was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. Finally, you're right about all of it. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. What we did to you, what I let Dad do, and I'm going to have to live with that for the rest of my life. He did hang up then, and I sat holding the phone, feeling strangely empty. I'd imagined David's apology so many times. In some fantasies, I threw it back in his face with righteous anger. In others, I accepted it gracefully and walked away with dignity. But the reality was just sad. Two people who'd once loved each other, destroyed by betrayal and family dysfunction and the poison of unchecked power. That night, Marcus called with more news. The SEC executed search warrants at Ashford Industries today. They seized computers, financial records, security footage. The federal investigation is officially at the stage where Richard should be hiring a criminal defense attorney, not a PR firm. He paused. Elena, there's something else. The anonymous friend who sent us that thumb drive, she came forward this afternoon. Her name is Patricia Lawrence. She's been Richard's executive assistant for 12 years. She's willing to testify. Why? I asked. Why now? Marcus's voice held admiration. She said she watched Richard destroy too many good people's careers. When she saw your wrongful termination suit, she pulled the security footage and kept copies before IT could delete them. She's risking everything. Her job, her reputation, probably her career prospects in this industry. She said she did it because someone had to, and she was tired of being complicit in Richard's cruelty by staying silent. I thought about Patricia. I'd met her a few times at company events, a quiet woman in her 50s with kind eyes. She'd always seemed almost invisible, blending into the background of Richard's empire. But she'd been watching, documenting, waiting for the right moment to act. "We need to protect her," I said urgently. "Richard will retaliate," Marcus agreed. "She's already resigned and hired her own attorney. We're working on immunity arrangements with the SEC. But you're right. Richard's going to be furious. Patricia isn't just an employee turning on him. She's someone he trusted completely. This betrayal, from his perspective, is going to cut deep." The next morning brought the news I'd been both dreading and anticipating. "Richard Ashford resigns as CEO amid federal investigation," read the headline. The announcement had come late last night. Richard was stepping down immediately, replaced by an interim CEO appointed by the board. The press release claimed he was taking time to focus on his family during this challenging period, but everyone understood the truth. The board had forced him out to protect the company's remaining value. Natalie sent me photos from inside Ashford Industries. Employees were walking around in a daze, unsure what came next. Several high-level executives had resigned in solidarity with Richard, or more likely to distance themselves before the investigation reached them. The company that had seemed so powerful and invincible just a week ago was crumbling, and I'd been the one to push the first domino. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but mostly I just felt tired. Sarah Chen called that afternoon. "Elena, I wanted to give you a heads up. Richard's PR team is shopping a different narrative to some of the more tabloid-leaning outlets. They're claiming you had an affair, that the divorce was because of your infidelity, that this whole investigation is elaborate revenge for getting caught cheating." She sounded disgusted. "It's complete fiction, but they're hoping mud will stick if they throw enough of it. Some outlets will probably run with it because it's more salacious than corporate fraud." "Let them," I said, surprising myself with how calm I felt. "I have phone records, email records, calendar appointments showing exactly where I was every day. If Richard wants to add defamation to his list of legal problems, that's his choice. But the affair story will collapse the moment anyone looks at actual evidence." Sarah agreed. "Plus, it makes him look desperate. Going after your character this aggressively just confirms that he can't defend against the actual accusations." That evening, I had dinner with my mother and sister at a small restaurant far from the city center where we were unlikely to be recognized. Mom looked tired, worried, older than her 62 years. "Sweetheart," she said, holding my hand across the table, "I know you're being strong, but you don't have to pretend with us. This has to be taking a toll." And there, in the safety of my family, my real family, the people who loved me without conditions or quarterly performance reviews, I finally let myself cry. Not pretty tears, but the ugly, gasping sobs of someone who'd held too much inside for too long. I cried for the marriage that had failed, for the years I'd spent trying to earn Richard's respect, for the career I'd built that had been destroyed so casually, for the public humiliation and the internet comments and the exhaustion of having to defend my basic credibility to strangers. Mom and Jen just held me, letting me break apart in the way I'd needed to since that board meeting. "I'm so tired," I whispered finally. "I know I'm winning, but I'm so tired." "Then rest," Mom said simply. "Marcus can handle things for a few days. You need to take care of yourself, Elena. Revenge and justice are important, but not if they destroy you in the process." She was right, of course. I'd been running on nothing but determination and coffee for days. That night back at the hotel, I took a sleeping pill, my first in years, and slept for 12 hours straight. No phone calls, no news alerts, no missed calls climbing into triple digits, just deep, dreamless sleep that my body and mind desperately needed. I woke feeling different, still tired, still hurt, but somehow steadier. The whirlwind of the past week had been necessary. Filing suits, gathering evidence, doing interviews, but I couldn't sustain that pace indefinitely. The investigation would continue for months. The legal proceedings would take even longer. This wasn't a sprint anymore. It was a marathon, and I needed to pace myself. Marcus had been right when he'd warned me about the long game. Justice wouldn't happen overnight, no matter how dramatic the headlines made it seem. That afternoon, I made a decision that surprised even Marcus. "I want to drop the wrongful termination suit," I told him. He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Elena, that's our strongest civil case. We can prove damages easily, and with the federal investigation backing us up." I shook my head. "I don't want Ashford Industries' money. I never did. The suit was just a tool to draw attention to the fraud. Now that the SEC is involved, now that criminal charges are likely, the civil suit is a distraction. I'd rather focus all our energy on making sure Richard faces actual consequences, not just writing a check." Marcus studied me carefully. "This isn't about the money for you, is it?" "It never was." I smiled slightly. "No, it's about making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. It's about changing a system where men like Richard can terrorize employees for years without consequences. The money, whether from a settlement or a judgment, that's not karma. That's not justice. Prison time for fraud, Richard losing everything he built on lies, that's what matters." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "You know what, Elena? I think you're right. Let's focus on the criminal case. Everything else is just noise." The SEC investigation moved faster than anyone anticipated. Within 2 weeks of Patricia Lawrence's testimony, federal agents had built a case that extended far beyond my wrongful termination. Richard Ashford hadn't just manipulated my performance data. He'd been systematically defrauding investors, inflating company valuations, and hiding losses for nearly a decade. The scheme was massive, complex, and entirely deliberate. Every move had been calculated to maintain his image as an infallible business leader, while the foundation rotted beneath. Marcus called me at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday with news that made my hands shake. "Elena, the U.S. Attorney's Office just announced they're filing filing criminal charges. 12 counts including securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Richard's being arrested this morning. They wanted me to tell you before it hits the news. I sat on my hotel bed, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what I was hearing. Arrested. Criminal charges. This was really happening. What about David? I asked quietly. Is he implicated? The investigation is ongoing, Marcus said carefully. David was a vice president, so they're examining whether he knowingly participated in any of the fraud. So far, the evidence suggests he was willfully ignorant rather than actively involved. He knew something wasn't right, but chose not to ask questions. That might save him from criminal charges, but it won't help his reputation. I thought about David sitting in that boardroom, saying nothing while his father destroyed my career. Willfully ignorant. Yes, that described him perfectly. Not evil, just weak. Choosing comfort over integrity because confronting his father would have been too difficult. The arrest happened at 8:30 a.m. I know because every news channel covered it live. Federal agents arriving at Richard's estate. Richard walking out in handcuffs, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. His expensive lawyer beside him, already shouting about prosecutorial overreach and political motivations. But the images told their own story. A powerful man brought low, led away like any common criminal. The perp walk, they call it in the movies. Except this was real, and I'd helped make it happen. My phone exploded with messages. Former colleagues expressing shock, asking if I'd known this was coming. Reporters requesting comments. Family members checking on my emotional state. Even a few people from David's social circle. Longtime friends who'd witnessed our relationship, reaching out with quiet apologies. I always thought something was wrong with how Richard treated you. One message read, I'm sorry I didn't say anything at the time. Sorry. Everyone was sorry now. Where had all these people been when I was being humiliated in that boardroom? Sarah Chen published a follow-up article within hours, from wrongful termination to criminal charges. How Elena Morrison's courage exposed decade of fraud. The piece detailed the entire timeline, from my initial firing to Patricia's whistleblowing to this morning's arrest. Sarah had interviewed federal prosecutors who praised the documentation I provided. Without Ms. Morrison's meticulous record-keeping, one prosecutor said, this investigation would have been significantly more difficult. She didn't just expose fraud, she handed us the roadmap to prove it. The article also revealed something I hadn't known. Patricia Lawrence hadn't acted alone. She'd been working with two other longtime Ashford Industries employees who'd grown disgusted with Richard's behavior. Together, they'd compiled years of evidence, emails, financial records, meeting notes, security footage. They'd waited patiently for the right moment, and my wrongful termination suit had given them the opening they needed. I was just the spark. They'd built the bonfire. That afternoon, David called. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Elena. His voice was hollow, empty of everything. I'm watching my father being arraigned on federal charges. The prosecutor is asking for $20 million bail because Dad's a flight risk. $20 million. Do you understand what you've done? I felt a flash of anger. What I've done? David, I documented fraud. I reported crimes. Your father did this to himself. He's still my father, David said, and I heard something break in his voice. Whatever he did, he's still my father, and you destroyed him. You destroyed our family, our company, everything. The unfairness of the accusation took my breath away. I didn't destroy anything, David. I exposed what was already rotten. Your father built his empire on lies and cruelty. I just refused to be another victim who stayed silent. If that makes me the villain in your story, then you've learned nothing. You wanted this, David said, his voice rising. You wanted revenge. You wanted to watch us suffer. You could have taken a settlement. You could have just walked away. But no, you had to burn everything down. I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even me. You're right. I wanted justice. I wanted consequences. And yes, part of me wanted you and your father to understand what it feels like to lose everything. But David, here's what you still don't get. None of this would have happened if your father hadn't committed actual crimes. If you hadn't treated me like disposable trash. You created this situation. I just refused to be destroyed by it. He hung up without another word. I sat holding the phone, feeling strange mixture of vindication and sadness. This was what I'd wanted. The Ashfords facing real consequences for their actions. But hearing the pain in David's voice, knowing I'd been instrumental in destroying his world, that complexity was harder than I'd anticipated. Justice wasn't clean or simple. It was messy and painful and morally ambiguous, even when you were certain you were right. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Marcus warned me that Richard's defense team would likely try to make me a focus, attempting to discredit my credibility as a witness. They'll argue you're a vindictive ex-wife who manipulated evidence to frame your father-in-law for crimes he didn't commit, Marcus explained. It won't work. The evidence is too solid, and Patricia's testimony backs you up completely. But they'll try anyway. You need to be prepared for them to attack you publicly. Sure enough, by Friday, Richard's lawyers were giving interviews suggesting exactly that narrative. Our client is innocent, his lead attorney declared on a cable news show. Ms. Morrison had motive and opportunity to fabricate evidence. The timing of her allegations, immediately after a contentious divorce, speaks volumes about her true motivations. We're confident that when the facts are examined objectively, Richard Ashford will be completely exonerated. The host pushed back, noting the multiple witnesses and the SEC's independent verification of the evidence, but the lawyer just smiled. The truth will come out in court. I watched the interview with my mother, who'd insisted on staying with me through this part. He's lying through his teeth, Mom said flatly, but he sounds confident. That's concerning. I shook my head. He's doing his job, creating reasonable doubt before the trial even starts. But Marcus says the prosecutor expected this. They have video evidence, multiple witnesses, witnesses, financial records. A good lawyer can create confusion, but he can't make facts disappear. That weekend, an unexpected visitor showed up at my hotel. The front desk called up, sounding uncertain. "Ms. Morrison, there's a Patricia Lawrence here to see you. She says it's urgent." I told them to send her up, curious and a little concerned. Patricia appeared at my door looking nervous, clutching a folder to her chest like a shield. "Elena, I'm sorry to bother you. I know you must be exhausted, but there's something you need to see before the hearing Monday." We sat in the hotel room's small sitting area, and Patricia opened her folder with shaking hands. When I was gathering evidence for the SEC, I found something else. Something I wasn't looking for but couldn't ignore once I saw it. She pulled out a document, an email chain between Richard and his personal attorney dated 2 years earlier. I read it once, then twice, my stomach turning with each pass. "This can't be real," I whispered. The emails discussed me specifically. Richard instructing his attorney to investigate whether I had any vulnerabilities that could be exploited if I ever became a problem. The attorney had compiled a report. My financial situation, my family relationships, even my medical history somehow obtained through unclear means. There were suggestions about how to neutralize me if necessary, including manufacturing performance issues that would justify termination. This wasn't just fraud. This was premeditated, targeted destruction of my career, planned years before it actually happened. "Why didn't you include this in your SEC testimony?" I asked Patricia, my voice shaking. She looked miserable. "Because it wasn't relevant to the securities fraud charges. But I thought you should know. Richard didn't just fire you randomly, Elena. He'd been planning it for years. You were always going to be his eventual target, probably because he saw you as a threat, someone smart enough to eventually notice his schemes." She paused. "I'm giving this to your divorce attorney. This level of malicious behavior might affect the settlement." I held the emails, feeling something shift inside me. All this time, I'd thought Richard's attack was opportunistic, a convenient scapegoat when he needed one. But he'd been planning my destruction since before David and I even got married. Every smile, every family dinner, every welcome to the family, all while he was building a file on how to destroy me if necessary. The betrayal went deeper than I'd imagined. This wasn't just business ruthlessness. This was personal malice, deliberate and calculated. Patricia left shortly after, having delivered her bombshell. I sat alone with those emails, reading them over and over. One phrase in particular stood out. "Elena Morrison represents a potential long-term liability. She's too competent to control easily and too ethical to be complicit in necessary business practices. Recommend monitoring closely and preparing exit strategy." Necessary business practices. That's what Richard called fraud. And I was a liability because I might actually have a conscience about it. Marcus arrived within the hour after I called him. He read the emails with growing fury. "Elena, this is vindictive prosecution of a whistleblower. The fact that he was planning your termination years in advance, that he was investigating you without cause, this goes beyond securities fraud. This is conspiracy, possibly harassment, definitely grounds for a civil suit that would be separate from anything we filed." He looked up at me. "Do you want to pursue this? Because I think you should. Richard needs to face consequences for the personal vendetta, not just the business crimes." I thought about it carefully. More lawsuits meant more time in court, more public scrutiny, more opportunities for Richard's lawyers to attack my character, but it also meant holding him accountable for the full scope of his actions. He hadn't just defrauded investors, he'd systematically planned the destruction of his daughter-in-law's career because she posed a hypothetical future threat that deserved its own reckoning. Violet, I decided. Everything. I want Richard to answer for all of it. The hearing on Monday was unlike anything I'd experienced. The federal courthouse was packed. Reporters, former Ashford Industries employees, investors who'd lost money, even a few protesters with signs about corporate accountability. I sat in the gallery next to Marcus, watching Richard being led in by federal marshals. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what he was facing. His lawyer sat beside him, projecting confidence that the evidence suggested was misplaced. The prosecutor was a woman named Janet Torres, mid-40s with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every defense trick in the book. She laid out the charges methodically, backing each one with specific evidence. When she mentioned my name, Elena Morrison, a former executive who first noticed irregularities in financial reporting, Richard's lawyer objected immediately. "Your Honor, Ms. Morrison's motivations are highly suspect. This is a woman scorned, seeking revenge against her ex-father-in-law." Judge Anderson, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, raised an eyebrow. "Counselor, are you suggesting that evidence of fraud becomes invalid if it's discovered by someone with personal grievances against the defendant?" The lawyer backpedaled. "No, Your Honor, but the court should consider the source and potential bias." Judge Anderson looked unimpressed. "The court will consider all evidence on its merits, regardless of who provided it. Unless you have specific proof that Ms. Morrison fabricated documents, I suggest we move on." The hearing lasted 3 hours. Patricia testified, her voice steady despite obvious nerves, describing years of watching Richard manipulate financial data. The former CFO testified via video link, explaining how Richard had pressured him to falsify reports. An SEC investigator testified about the scope of the fraud, over $50 million in false valuations, affecting hundreds of investors. By the time it ended, Richard's bail was set at $15 million. He was ordered to surrender his passport, and he was placed under house arrest pending trial. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. I'd prepared a brief statement with Marcus's help. "Justice isn't about revenge or personal grievances," I said, reading from my notes to keep my voice steady. "It's about accountability. Richard Ashford used his power to hurt people, employees, investors, anyone who threatened his control. Today Today's hearing is just the beginning of ensuring he faces consequences for those actions. I'm grateful to everyone who had the courage to come forward, especially Patricia Lawrence and the other whistleblowers who risked everything to expose the truth. Questions flew immediately. How do you respond to accusations that this is revenge? Do you feel vindicated? What do you say to people who think you're trying to destroy your ex-husband's family? I held up my hand. I have one more thing to say. To anyone who's ever been fired unfairly, who's ever been told their concerns don't matter, who's ever been called vindictive for standing up for yourself, you're not alone, and you're not wrong. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to stay silent, even when powerful people want you to. Thank you. I walked away from the cameras, Marcus beside me creating a buffer between me and the pressing reporters. My phone was already buzzing with reactions, mostly supportive, some still skeptical, a few outright hostile. But I'd said what I needed to say. The rest would play out in court, where evidence mattered more than narratives and truth had a better chance of winning than it did on social media. That evening, my divorce attorney called with news about the settlement negotiations. David's lawyer wanted to talk. The emails Patricia had found, the ones showing Richard's premeditated plan to destroy me, had apparently terrified them. They're offering you everything, my attorney said, sounding almost gleeful. Full value of marital assets split 50-50. David keeps his debts, you keep yours, and most importantly, no non-disclosure agreement. They've dropped all demands for confidentiality. They just want this settled before those emails become public. What do they think I'll do with the emails? I asked. My attorney chuckled. Probably exactly what I advised you to do. Hold them for the criminal trial. Those emails prove malicious intent, which strengthens the prosecution's case significantly. David knows that. He's trying to limit the damage to whatever's left of the Ashford family reputation. I thought about David's voice during our last phone call, the pain and betrayal he'd felt watching his father's arrest. Part of me felt sorry for him, but a larger part remembered that shelter list. Accept the settlement, I decided. But I want one additional clause. David has to provide a written statement acknowledging that my termination was unjustified and that I was a valuable employee who was wrongfully fired. I want that on record, signed by him, non-negotiable. My attorney was quiet for a moment. Elena, that's asking him to publicly contradict his father's narrative. He might not agree. I smiled slightly. Then he can watch those emails be entered into evidence at his father's trial. His choice. David agreed to the clause within 2 hours. The written statement arrived via email that evening. I acknowledged that Elena Morrison was a dedicated and highly competent executive during her tenure at Ashford Industries. Her termination was not based on legitimate performance issues. I regret my failure to recognize and defend her contributions to the company and to our marriage. She deserved better than what she received from me and my family. It wasn't poetry, but it was truth. Signed by David Ashford, dated and notarized. Official acknowledgement that I'd been right all along. I printed the statement and added it to my growing folder of vindication. Tomorrow, Marcus would file the additional civil suit based on Patricia's emails. The criminal trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. The divorce would be final in 3 months. Slowly, systematically, every piece was falling into place. Richard Ashford's empire wasn't just collapsing. It was being methodically dismantled, brick by brick, with documentation and legal proceedings and the testimony of people he'd underestimated and betrayed. That night, I finally allowed myself to feel something other than determination. Sitting in my hotel room, looking out over the city lights, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The battle wasn't over. The trial would be brutal, and Richard's lawyers would do everything possible to destroy my credibility. But I'd already won the only victory that really mattered. I'd stood up. I'd refused to be silenced. I'd turned my pain into action and my documentation into justice. Whatever happened next, I'd done what so many others couldn't or wouldn't. I'd fought back, and I'd won. The trial began on a gray morning in early November, 6 weeks after Richard's arrest. The federal courthouse was packed with journalists, former employees, investors, and curious onlookers who'd followed the story from the beginning. I sat in the front row of the gallery, positioned where Richard would see me every time he looked up from the defense table. Marcus had advised me to attend every day. Your presence reminds everyone what this case is really about, he'd said. Not abstract financial crimes, but real people whose lives Richard destroyed. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Janet Torres with surgical precision. She outlined the scope of Richard's fraud: $53 million in falsified valuations, manipulated performance data for 12 executives over 8 years, securities violations that affected over 200 investors. This wasn't a mistake, she told the jury. This wasn't poor judgment or aggressive accounting. This was deliberate, systematic fraud designed to maintain one man's image of infallibility while enriching himself at others' expense. Richard's defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Theodore Blackwell, who charged $800 per hour, countered with the expected narrative. Richard Ashford built a company that employed hundreds of people and generated millions in economic value. He made difficult business decisions that sometimes hurt feelings, but that's not criminal. The prosecution wants you to believe that every executive who failed at Ashford Industries was actually a victim of fraud. The simpler explanation: some people just weren't good at their jobs, including Ms. Morrison, who has turned personal failure into a vindictive crusade. I kept my expression neutral, as Blackwell painted me as a bitter ex-wife fabricating evidence. I'd been prepared for this. Marcus had warned me that they'd go after my character relentlessly because they couldn't effectively challenge the documentation. Let them try, I thought. The numbers don't lie, and I have videos of Richard explicitly ordering fraud. Character assassination only works when the evidence is weak. The prosecution called its first witness, Patricia Lawrence. She walked to the stand with remarkable composure for someone who'd spent 12 years enabling Richard's crimes before finally turning against him. Janet Torres guided her through years of evidence gathering. Ms. Lawrence, when did you first become aware that Mr. Ashford was manipulating financial data? Patricia's voice was steady. Approximately 7 years ago. I noticed discrepancies between the reports executives submitted and the versions Mr. Ashford presented to the board. And what did you do with that information? Torres asked. Patricia looked directly at Richard. Nothing. I was afraid. Mr. Ashford had a reputation for destroying anyone who questioned him. I'd seen it happen to others, so I stayed quiet and hated myself for it. Her voice wavered slightly. Until Elena Morrison. When I saw what he did to her, publicly humiliating her, manipulating her numbers just like the others, and then watching her refuse to stay silent, I realized I couldn't be complicit anymore. She found the courage I'd lacked for years. Blackwell's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned Patricia's motivations, suggested she'd fabricated evidence to save herself from prosecution, implied she was working with me to frame Richard, but Patricia held firm. When Blackwell asked why the jury should believe a woman who'd admitted to years of enabling fraud, Patricia's answer was simple. Because I kept copies of everything. Every email, every altered spreadsheet, every security video. I was complicit, yes, but I documented my complicity. And now I'm using that documentation to make sure Mr. Ashford faces consequences for what we did together. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks. Witness after witness testified about Richard's pattern of manipulation. The former CFO described being pressured to falsify reports or face termination. 3 other executives I'd never met told stories eerily similar to mine. Excellent performance suddenly characterized as failures. Public terminations designed to humiliate. NDAs used to buy silence. An SEC investigator walked the jury through 50 pages of financial irregularities, each one meticulously documented and proven. Then came my testimony. Janet Torres had prepared me extensively, but nothing quite captured the strangeness of sitting in that witness box, swearing to tell the truth, with Richard staring at me from the defense table. Ms. Morrison, Torres began, please tell the jury about your employment at Ashford Industries. I described 7 years of work, steady promotions, consistently high performance reviews, then the shift 3 months before my termination, when my report started not matching the numbers being presented at board meetings. Did you confront Mr. Ashford about these discrepancies? Torres asked. Yes, twice. The first time he told me I must have made calculation errors. The second time he suggested I was too stressed and should consider taking a leave of absence. I looked directly at the jury. I wasn't stressed and I hadn't made errors. My original reports were correct. Someone was changing them after I submitted them. I started keeping copies of everything, originals and the altered versions. That's what led us here. Blackwell's cross-examination focused on my relationship with David. Ms. Morrison, isn't it true that your marriage was failing before your termination? I met his eyes steadily. My marriage failed after my termination, when my husband handed me a list of homeless shelters and told me I was on my own. Before that, we had problems like any couple, but nothing that suggested I'd fabricate evidence to frame my father-in-law for crimes he didn't commit. But you were angry, Blackwell pressed. Hurt, looking for revenge. I considered the question carefully. I was angry, yes. When someone publicly humiliates you and destroys your career based on lies, anger is a reasonable response. But I didn't fabricate anything. I documented what actually happened. If that documentation makes Mr. Ashford look guilty, it's because he is guilty. My emotions don't change the facts. Blackwell tried several more approaches, suggesting I'd misunderstood the numbers, implying I'd conspired with Patricia to frame Richard, even hinting that I'd stolen proprietary information. Each attack fell flat against the wall of documentation I'd maintained. When Torres redirected, she asked one final question. Ms. Morrison, if you could go back to that board meeting where you were fired, knowing everything that would follow, the divorce, the public scrutiny, this trial, would you still choose to fight back? I didn't hesitate. Yes, because this isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone Richard hurt and everyone he would have hurt in the future if someone didn't stop him. Would I prefer that my marriage hadn't fallen apart and my career hadn't been destroyed? Of course, but given that those things happened, I had a choice. Stay silent or fight back. I chose to fight, and I'd make that same choice again. The prosecution rested after 3 weeks of testimony. The evidence was overwhelming. Videos of Richard ordering fraud, emails proving conspiracy, spreadsheets showing systematic manipulation, witness after witness confirming the pattern. Blackwell's defense strategy became clear during his case presentation. Deny everything, attack the witness's credibility, and hope the jury decided that powerful men don't commit crimes this obviously. It was a desperate strategy because he had nothing else. Richard took the stand in his own defense, against his lawyer's advice according to courthouse rumors. He was arrogant, combative, refusing to show even a hint of remorse. Those executives failed, he insisted. Their terminations were justified by their performance. If their feelings were hurt, that's unfortunate. But business isn't about protecting people's emotions. When the prosecutor asked about the videos showing him ordering financial manipulation, Richard claimed they were taken out of context. I was discussing hypothetical scenarios, testing my CFO's ethical boundaries. The jury clearly wasn't buying it. I watched their faces as Richard spoke. Skepticism, disgust, occasionally outright disbelief. When Blackwell asked Richard about me specifically, his mask slipped. Elena was lazy, entitled, and vindictive, he said, his voice tight with anger. She married my son for money and status, and when she couldn't maintain the standards required. She turned this into some feminist crusade about evil men destroying innocent women. It's pathetic. Janet Torres's cross-examination was devastating. She walked Richard through each piece of evidence, watching him squirm as he tried to explain away video footage, emails in his own words, financial records that proved his lies. Mr. Ashford, you've testified that Ms. Morrison was lazy and incompetent, yet her performance reviews before the final quarter were exemplary. How do you explain that? Richard's face reddened. Sometimes it takes time for incompetence to become apparent. Or sometimes, Torres said quietly, competent employees become inconvenient, and powerful men decide to destroy them. Isn't that what really happened here? Richard glared at her. I've spent 30 years building that company. I don't need to destroy anyone. People destroy themselves. Torres smiled slightly. Mr. Ashford, I think this jury will agree that the only person who destroyed anything here is you. No further questions. The closing arguments happened on a Friday. Blackwell gave an impassioned speech about reasonable doubt, the dangers of criminalizing business decisions, and the need to be skeptical of bitter ex-wives with axes to grind. Torres responded with cold facts. 53 million in fraud, 12 victims, 8 years of systematic deception. Richard Ashford had power, and he abused it, she told the jury. He hurt people for profit and ego. The evidence isn't ambiguous. The videos aren't fake. The witnesses aren't lying. This is a straightforward case of a man who thought he was above the law, learning that he's not. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I spent that time in a strange limbo, unable to focus on anything else, checking my phone constantly for updates. Marcus tried to keep me distracted with discussions about the civil suits still pending, but my mind kept returning to that courtroom, wondering what the jury was thinking, whether they believed me or Richard's characterization of me as a vindictive woman fabricating evidence. The verdict came on a Tuesday afternoon. The courtroom was packed again, every seat filled with people who'd followed this case for months. I sat between Marcus and my mother, holding Mom's hand so tightly my fingers went numb. Richard sat at the defense table, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see tension in his shoulders. The jury filed in, none of them looking at Richard, a sign the defense attorney seemed to recognize with visible resignation. On the count of securities fraud, how do you find? The judge asked. Guilty, the foreperson said. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge called for order. Count after count, the verdict was the same. Guilty of wire fraud, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of obstruction of justice. 12 counts, 12 guilty verdicts. Richard's face went pale, then red, then pale again. His lawyer was already making notes for the appeal. But in that moment, watching Richard realize that he would actually face consequences for his actions, I felt something release in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying for months. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Federal guidelines suggested Richard was looking at 15 to 20 years in prison. At 61 years old, that was effectively a life sentence. His bail was revoked immediately. The judge cited flight risk and the guilty verdict as sufficient reason to remand him to custody. Federal marshals led Richard out in handcuffs while his lawyer protested and his wife sobbed in the gallery. I watched him go, feeling neither triumph nor pity, just a quiet sense of justice finally being served. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed me again. This time, I had a longer statement prepared. Today's verdict isn't just about one man or one company. It's about the principle that power doesn't protect you from consequences when you break the law. Richard Ashford spent decades believing he was untouchable. He hurt people, employees, investors, families, without hesitation because he thought his wealth and connections made him immune to accountability. This jury proved him wrong. I paused, looking directly at the cameras. To everyone who's been told to stay quiet about injustice because fighting back is too hard or too risky, today proves that it's possible. It's not easy. It cost me my marriage, my career, months of my life, and my peace of mind. But it was worth it, because now Richard Ashford will spend the next decade or more in federal prison, and no one else will have to suffer what I suffered. That's what justice looks like. Not revenge, not vindictiveness, just consequences. The questions came rapid fire. How do you feel? Do you have any message for your ex-husband? What's next for you? I held up my hand. I feel relieved, exhausted, but relieved. As for David, I hope he learns from his father's mistakes. Loyalty to family doesn't mean enabling crimes or cruelty. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable. As for what's next, I'm going to rest, rebuild, and maybe help other people who find themselves in similar situations find the courage to fight back. David called that evening. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won again. Elena, his voice was broken, defeated. I just wanted you to know. I watched the whole trial, every day, and I finally understand. You weren't trying to destroy us. You were just trying to protect yourself from being destroyed. I'm sorry I couldn't see that sooner. I'm sorry for everything. He paused. Dad's going to prison. Our family name is ruined. The company will probably fold. And you know what the worst part is? We deserved it. All of it. I listened to him cry for a moment before responding. David, I never wanted to destroy your family. I just wanted to stop being hurt by it. But your father made choices, terrible, criminal choices, and those choices had consequences. I'm not responsible for his crimes. I'm just the person who refused to stay silent about them. I took a breath. I hope you find a way to build a life that isn't defined by your father's legacy. You're not Richard. You don't have to be him. Thank you, David whispered, for everything, even for this. I think I needed to hit bottom to realize how toxic everything was. He hung up, and I sat holding the phone, feeling a chapter finally closing. David and I would never be friends. Too much had happened, too much betrayal and pain. But maybe he'd learn something from this disaster. Maybe he'd become someone better than the man who'd handed me that shelter list. I hoped so, for his sake. The sentencing hearing brought a kind of closure I hadn't expected. Richard stood before the judge, still defiant even after the guilty verdict. When given a chance to address the court, he didn't apologize. "I built that company from nothing," he said, his voice hard. "I created jobs, generated wealth, contributed to this community. The fact that some people's feelings got hurt along the way doesn't negate my accomplishments. I refuse to be ashamed of my success." Judge Anderson looked at him with something close to disgust. "Mr. Ashford, you're not being sentenced for hurting feelings. You're being sentenced for fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Your accomplishments don't erase your crimes. They make them worse. You had everything, and you still felt entitled to cheat. The court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years supervised release. You will also pay restitution to the victims of your fraud in the amount of $53 million plus interest. 18 years. Richard would be 79 when he got out, assuming he served the full sentence. His face went gray as the judge pronounced sentence. The marshals led him away for the final time, and I watched him go, feeling nothing but peace. It was over. The man who'd tried to destroy me had destroyed himself instead, and justice, real, meaningful justice, had been served. The aftermath came in waves. Ashford Industries filed for bankruptcy 3 weeks after the sentencing. David found work at a smaller firm, starting over in a junior position without the Ashford name to protect him. Patricia Lawrence wrote a book about her experience as a corporate whistleblower, donating the proceeds to organizations supporting women in business. The other executives Richard had targeted received settlements from the bankruptcy proceedings, not full restitution, but acknowledgement that they'd been wronged. As for me, I took Marcus's advice and took time to heal. I moved to Seattle, far from the city where my marriage had ended and my career had been destroyed. I found work at a tech company that valued my skills without requiring me to constantly prove my worth. I started seeing a therapist who helped me process the trauma of betrayal and the complex emotions around the trial. Slowly, carefully, I began rebuilding a life that was mine alone, not defined by the Ashfords or their legacy of cruelty. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a letter from Richard. It was addressed to me at Marcus's office. Richard didn't have my new address. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. The letter was short, handwritten, nothing like the arrogant man I'd known. "Elena, I've had time to think in here. About what I did. About who I became. You were right about everything. I destroyed good people to protect my ego. I hurt my own family. I built an empire on lies and convinced myself that success justified any method. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I finally see the truth you tried to show me. You won. Not just legally, but morally. You were the better person all along. I hope you find happiness in your new life. You deserve it more than I ever did." I read the letter twice, then filed it away. It didn't change anything. Richard was still in prison, still facing the consequences of his choices, but it was an acknowledgement I hadn't expected. Even people like Richard, given enough time and forced reflection, could eventually recognize the damage they'd caused. It didn't absolve him, didn't make what he'd done acceptable, but it proved that some part of him had been capable of growth, even if it took losing everything for that growth to happen. 3 years had passed since that gray November morning when the jury read their verdict. I stood in the kitchen of my Seattle townhouse, morning coffee in hand, watching rain streak down the windows. The view overlooked Elliott Bay, a tranquil scene that had become my daily meditation. This life, quiet, purposeful, mine, bore no resemblance to the one I'd left behind in that other city, in that other existence as Mrs. David Ashford. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie, my former colleague who'd become one of my closest friends through this entire ordeal. "Did you see the news? Richard denied parole, won't be eligible again for another 2 years." I pulled up the article on my laptop. Richard had appeared before the parole board yesterday, his first opportunity for early release after serving 3 years of his 18-year sentence. The board had unanimously denied him, citing his continued failure to demonstrate genuine remorse for his actions. According to the article, Richard had blamed his victims during the hearing, suggesting that if they'd been stronger employees, he wouldn't have needed to manipulate their performance data. The parole board hadn't appreciated that perspective. "Mr. Ashford shows no understanding of the harm he caused," the board chair had stated. "Until he accepts full responsibility for his crimes without qualification or blame shifting, he presents a risk of reoffending." I smiled slightly, sipping my coffee. Some people never learned. Even prison hadn't taught Richard that his actions had consequences he couldn't charm or manipulate his way out of. My work phone rang, the number I used for my consulting business. After moving to Seattle, I'd started advising companies on ethical compliance and corporate governance, helping them build systems that prevented the kind of fraud Richard had perpetrated. The irony wasn't lost on me that my experience being destroyed by a corrupt CEO had become my most valuable professional credential. "Elena Morrison," I answered. "Ms. Morrison, this is Jennifer Chen from Pacific Northwest Business Journal. We're doing a feature on corporate whistleblowers and ethical business practices. Your case with Ashford Industries is frequently cited as a watershed moment. Would you be willing to be interviewed?" I'd done several interviews over the past 3 years, each one easier than the last. The story no longer felt like an open wound, but more like a scar, visible evidence of survival, not ongoing trauma. "I'd be happy to," I replied. We scheduled the interview for the following week. After hanging up, I returned to my laptop and the consulting proposal I was writing for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company concerned about compliance issues in their clinical trials division. This was my life now, using my experience to help prevent others from suffering what I'd endured. That afternoon, I met my sister Jen for lunch at a small cafe near Pike Place Market. She was visiting from the East Coast with her family, and we'd carved out time for just the two of us. "You look good," she said, studying my face across the table. "Really good. Not just surface level, I'm fine, good, but genuinely content. I considered her observation. She was right. The past 3 years had been transformative in ways I couldn't have anticipated when I was living in that hotel room, preparing for trial, holding on to rage and determination like lifelines. I am content, I admitted. It's strange. I lost so much. My marriage, my career, years of my life consumed by legal battles. But I gained something too. Clarity about who I am and what I'm willing to accept. I'll never again let someone treat me as disposable. That lesson was expensive, but it was worth the price. Jen squeezed my hand. Mom worries you're still alone, that David ruined relationships for you. I laughed softly. Tell Mom I'm not alone. I'm selective. There's a difference. I date, I have friends, I have a life I built on my own terms. Eventually, maybe I'll meet someone worth sharing that life with, but I'm not incomplete without it. The truth was, I had dated over the past year. Careful, cautious forays back into trusting someone with emotional intimacy. Nothing serious yet, but I'd discovered I wasn't broken. David and Richard had tried to destroy me, but they'd only succeeded in revealing my strength. That realization had been liberating in ways I was still discovering. After lunch, I walked through Pike Place Market, anonymous among the tourists and locals. Nobody here knew my story. I was just another woman buying flowers and fresh vegetables, living an ordinary life. That anonymity was precious after years of being the public face of corporate whistleblowing. My phone rang again. Marcus this time. Elena, I have news about the civil settlements. We'd filed multiple lawsuits in the aftermath of the criminal trial, including suits for wrongful termination, emotional distress, and the conspiracy I'd discovered in those emails Patricia had found. The bankruptcy proceedings had complicated everything, but Marcus had been relentless in pursuing whatever compensation remained. The bankruptcy trustee finalized the victim compensation fund. You're getting $875,000. Not what you deserved, but better than nothing. I processed the number. Nearly $1 million from the ruins of Ashford Industries. It wouldn't undo the damage, wouldn't give me back those years of stress and trauma, but it was acknowledgement that I'd been wronged, that my suffering had been real and compensable. What about the other executives? I asked. Marcus's smile was audible in his voice. Everyone's getting something. The 11 other people Richard targeted are splitting about $2.3 million. Patricia's getting $500,000 for her cooperation. Even some of the lower-level employees who were laid off when the company collapsed are getting small settlements. Good, I said, meaning it. This had never been just about me. Richard had hurt dozens of people over the years, and they all deserved some measure of justice. The money couldn't erase what happened, but it helped. After hanging up with Marcus, I walked to a small park overlooking the water and sat on a bench, watching ferries cross the bay. $875,000. Combined with what I'd saved over the past 3 years of consulting work, I was financially secure for the first time since the divorce. The irony was sharp. I'd ended up better off than if I'd taken Richard's original settlement offer of $600,000 and stayed silent. That evening, I logged into my email to find a message that made me pause. The subject line read, "Thank you from someone you helped." I opened it cautiously. "Ms. Morrison, you don't know me, but my name is Rachel Kim. I was a junior executive at Ashford Industries when you filed your lawsuit. I watched everything unfold. The investigation, the trial, the bankruptcy. I was terrified throughout because I'd seen how Richard destroyed people who challenged him. But watching you stand up to him, refuse to be silenced, fight back even when it seemed impossible, that gave me courage I didn't know I had." The email continued. 2 years ago, I started experiencing similar treatment at my new company. My boss was manipulating my performance data, setting me up to fail. The old me would have just accepted it, assuming I really was failing. But because of your example, I documented everything. I hired a lawyer, I filed complaints. Last month, my boss was fired after an internal investigation confirmed he'd been targeting multiple employees with the same tactics Richard used. I kept my job and got promoted. I'm writing to tell you that your story mattered. It changed my life. Thank you for being brave enough to fight back. I read Rachel's email 3 times, tears streaming down my face. This was why it had all been worth it. Not the money, not the vindication, not even seeing Richard sentenced to prison. It was knowing that my refusal to stay silent had empowered others to stand up for themselves, that the story of my pain had become someone else's roadmap to justice. I responded to Rachel, thanking her for sharing her story and congratulating her on her courage. Then I forwarded the email to Marcus with a simple note. This is what victory looks like. The interview with Pacific Northwest Business Journal happened the following Tuesday in a sleek downtown office. The journalist, Jennifer Chen, was thorough and insightful, asking questions that went beyond the basic facts of the case to explore the psychological and emotional dimensions of whistleblowing. "What would you say to someone who's in a similar situation right now?" she asked. "Someone who knows their employer is doing something wrong but is terrified of the consequences of speaking up?" I thought carefully before responding. I'd tell them that the fear is valid. There are consequences, sometimes severe consequences, to challenging powerful people. I lost my marriage, my career, years of peace. That's real, and I won't minimize it by pretending everything worked out perfectly. I paused. But I'd also tell them that staying silent has consequences too. Living with the knowledge that you enabled wrongdoing, that your silence allowed others to be hurt, that eats at you in ways that are harder to recover from than external consequences. For me, the hardest moments weren't facing Richard's lawyers or reading vicious comments online. They were the moments before I decided to fight back, when I was still considering just taking a settlement and disappearing. Jennifer leaned forward, her expression intent. "What changed? What made you decide to fight?" I smiled slightly, remembering that hotel room, that moment of clarity when I'd called Marcus and asked him to file everything. I realized that Richard Richard and David had already taken so much from me. My job, my marriage, my sense of security. If I stayed silent to protect their comfort, I'd be giving them my integrity too. That was the one thing they couldn't take unless I handed it over. So I chose to keep it. The article published 2 weeks later with the headline, "The Cost of Justice, Elena Morrison on Corporate Whistleblowing 3 years later." It was balanced, thoughtful, exploring both the victories and the ongoing challenges of life after blowing the whistle. Jennifer had interviewed several other whistleblowers, and the common theme was resilience. People who'd lost everything and somehow found ways to rebuild. The article ended with my quote about integrity, and within days, I was receiving messages from people across the country sharing their own stories. 4 months later, I was invited to speak at a conference on corporate ethics in San Francisco. The organizers wanted me to share my experience with an audience of compliance officers, HR professionals, and business leaders. I'd done smaller speaking engagements before, but this was different. 800 people in a hotel ballroom, my story projected on screens behind me as a cautionary tale and inspiration simultaneously. Standing backstage before my presentation, I felt the old anxiety flutter in my chest. What if they didn't believe me? What if they thought I was just bitter? What if? But then I remembered Richard's face when the guilty verdict was read. David's broken voice admitting they'd deserved it. Rachel Kim's email thanking me for giving her courage. I walked onto that stage with my head high, and for 30 minutes I told my story with complete honesty. The pain, the fear, the moments I'd wanted to give up, and the determination that kept me going. The standing ovation afterward lasted 3 minutes. People waited in line for an hour to speak with me, to share their own experiences, to ask advice. I stayed until I'd spoken with every single person. That evening, sitting in my hotel room overlooking the San Francisco skyline, I received an unexpected call. "Elena Morrison?" the voice asked. "This is Catherine Wells from the Department of Justice. I'm calling regarding the Ashford Industries case." My stomach clenched. "What now?" "I wanted to inform you that Richard Ashford's appeal was denied this afternoon. The conviction stands, and he'll serve his full sentence." I thought you'd want to know. Relief washed over me. Richard's lawyers had been fighting for 3 years, claiming everything from ineffective counsel to tainted evidence. Every appeal had failed, but there'd always been the possibility that something would succeed, that he'd find a legal loophole and escape consequences. Now that door was permanently closed. "Thank you for letting me know," I managed. Catherine's voice warmed slightly. "Ms. Morrison, I've worked on hundreds of fraud cases. Very few whistleblowers show the courage and tenacity you demonstrated. You should be proud of what you accomplished." After hanging up, I texted Marcus. "Appeal denied. It's finally over." His response came immediately. "Justice took its time, but it arrived. Proud of you, Elena." I sat by the window for a long time, watching the city lights, processing the finality of it. Richard would spend at least 15 more years in prison, probably dying there given his age and health issues. David was rebuilding his life in obscurity, never having recovered from the scandal. Ashford Industries was defunct, its assets liquidated, its legacy one of corruption rather than success. And me? I was free, truly, completely free of the shadow that family had cast over my life. I'd built something new from the ashes of everything I'd lost, a career that meant something, friendships based on mutual respect rather than status, a sense of self that didn't require external validation. The woman who'd sat in that boardroom 3 years ago, being fired and humiliated, would barely recognize who I'd become. That woman had been trying to please people who would never be pleased, seeking approval from those who'd already decided she was disposable. 6 months later, I was approached by a publisher interested in my story. "We've been following your case since the beginning," the editor explained over coffee in Seattle. "Your story resonates because it's about more than corporate fraud. It's about finding the courage to stand up when the cost is everything you have. That's universal." I considered the offer carefully. Writing a book would mean reliving everything in detail, exposing even more of my private pain for public consumption. But it would also mean controlling my own narrative, ensuring my story was told accurately. I signed the contract 3 weeks later. The book took a year to write. Long hours of remembering, processing, finding words for experiences that still sometimes felt too big for language. I called it The Price of Truth, How Refusing to Stay Silent Changed Everything. It wasn't just about Richard and David and the betrayal. It was about the system that enabled men like Richard, about the costs women pay for demanding basic respect, about the transformation that happens when you stop seeking validation from people who don't value you. The book published to stronger reception than I'd anticipated. It hit several bestseller lists, not because of sensationalism, but because the story touched something people recognized, the experience of being underestimated, discarded, and finding strength in that devastation. I did a book tour, speaking in cities across the country, meeting people whose stories mirrored mine in countless ways. The names and details changed, but the core experience, powerful person abuses power, victim fights back, system slowly grinds toward justice, was depressingly common. During a signing in Boston, a young woman waited until everyone else had left. "Ms. Morrison," she said quietly, "I'm in your exact situation right now. My boss is manipulating my data, setting me up to fail. I've documented everything, but I'm terrified to come forward. My husband says I should just find another job, that fighting isn't worth it. What should I do?" I looked at her tired eyes, her nervous hands, and saw myself 3 years earlier. "I can't tell you what to do," I said honestly. "Fighting is brutal and expensive and emotionally devastating, but so is living with the knowledge that you let someone destroy you without resistance. Only you can decide which price you're willing to pay." She nodded, tears welling up. "I know what I have to do. I just needed to hear that it's possible to survive it." I took her hand. "It's not just possible. impossible. You'll be stronger afterward, not because suffering is noble or pain builds character, but because standing up for yourself, even when it costs everything, teaches you that you're worth defending. And once you know that, really know it in your bones, no one can take it from you. She left with my book signed. To Sarah, your courage already exists. You just need to claim it. Elena. Now, standing in my Seattle kitchen 5 years after that board meeting that changed everything, I reflect on the journey with a clarity that only distance provides. Richard is still in prison, his parole denied repeatedly. David remarried last year, I heard through mutual acquaintances, to someone outside the business world. He works in middle management at a logistics company, no longer seeking the status and power that once defined his identity. Patricia published her second book and became a sought-after speaker on corporate ethics. The other executives Richard targeted have moved on, carrying scars, but also the satisfaction of having been vindicated. My mother asks sometimes if I'm angry about the years lost to legal battles and recovery. The truth is, I'm not. Those years weren't lost. They were invested in something more valuable than a career or marriage or financial security. They were invested in learning that my worth isn't determined by other people's perception, that justice is possible even against overwhelming power, and that the most important person I needed to prove anything to was myself. The woman who walked out of that boardroom in disgrace is gone. In her place is someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more comfortable in her own skin. Last week, I received a letter from Richard, his fourth since being imprisoned, each one slightly more reflective than the last. This one was different. Elena, I've been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. I'm writing not to ask for sympathy. I don't deserve it, but to thank you. That sounds absurd, I know. But prison gave me something I never had when I was free. Time to think about who I'd become. You held up a mirror I'd been avoiding my entire life. Everything I did to you, I'd done to others. Everyone I hurt, I justified as necessary for success. You were just the first person brave enough to say no. I'm dying knowing I wasted my life building an empire on cruelty. You're living knowing you refused to be another brick in that empire. You won, not just legally, but morally, completely. I hope that knowledge brings you peace. I read the letter twice, then filed it away with the others. Richard's impending death didn't change anything. He'd still committed his crimes, still hurt countless people, still earned his consequences. But his acknowledgement, genuine this time, provided a kind of closure. The man who'd tried to destroy me had been destroyed by his own choices, had lived long enough to understand that, and would die alone in a prison medical ward. That wasn't revenge I'd sought. It was just karma finally catching up. My phone buzzed with a text from someone I'd been dating for the past 8 months. Alex, a marine biologist who knew my story, but valued me for who I was now, not what I'd survived. Dinner tonight? There's a new Thai place I want to try. I smiled, typing back my acceptance. This life I'd built from the ruins of my marriage and career wasn't perfect. I still had nightmares occasionally about that boardroom. I still felt a flutter of anxiety when reviewing financial reports, waiting for numbers not to match. But those were scars, not open wounds. Evidence of survival, not ongoing trauma. What happened to me wasn't fair. The betrayal, the humiliation, the years of fighting for basic acknowledgement that I'd been wronged, none of it should have been necessary. In a just world, Richard would have been stopped long before I ever encountered him. In a just world, David would have stood up for his wife instead of handing her a list of homeless shelters. In a just world, I wouldn't have needed to sacrifice so much just to prove what everyone should have believed from the beginning. But this isn't a just world. It's a world where justice has to be fought for, often at tremendous cost. The question isn't whether that's fair. The question is whether you're willing to pay the price for your own dignity. I was. And 3 years of legal battles, public scrutiny, financial uncertainty, and emotional devastation later, I'd do it again. Not because I'm noble or brave or special, but because the alternative, staying silent, accepting Richard's characterization of me as a failure, living the rest of my life knowing I'd let him win, that price was higher than anything the fight cost me. To anyone reading this who's facing their own Richard Ashford, their own moment of betrayal and decision, I can't promise it will be easy. It won't be. I can't promise you'll win every battle. You won't. But I can promise that refusing to be silenced, refusing to accept mistreatment, standing up even when the cost seems unbearable, that choice defines who you are in ways that success or failure never can. You might lose everything fighting back, but staying silent, you'll lose something more important, your sense that you're worth fighting for. 3 years ago, I walked out of a courtroom watching my father-in-law be sentenced to 18 years in prison for crimes I'd exposed. Last year, I published a best-selling book about the experience. Today, I'm sitting in a home I bought with my own money, planning dinner with someone who respects me, working a job that matters to me. The Ashfords are footnotes in my story now, important for how they shaped me, but not for who I became. I am no longer defined by their betrayal. I'm defined by my response to it. And that, finally, is what justice looks like. Not just courtrooms and verdicts and prison sentences, but the peace that comes from knowing you stood up when it mattered most, even when it cost you everything. They tried to make me disappear into a homeless shelter, forgotten and broken. Instead, I made sure everyone would remember exactly who Richard and David Ashford really were. They wanted me erased from their story. I made them permanent characters in mine, cautionary tales of what happens when you betray someone who refuses to stay silent. So what do you think of this story? Have you ever faced a situation where standing up for yourself meant risking everything? Have you ever encountered someone like Richard who abused their power, assuming no one would fight back? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support support means everything. Thank you for being here, for listening to my story, and for believing that justice, however delayed, is always worth fighting for.